And in our world, how we define development is that which people do for themselves. It's not what outsiders come in and do for people. It's what people do on their own. So we don't measure our success by what we do. We measure our success by what the community does on its own. That's true development. That's what's going to make their poverty solutions sustainable for them long after we leave.
Hello, sweet friends. I'm Stephanie Jacobs, a storyteller and advocate for social justice, and your host of the Love Light Stories podcast, a place where we uncover a deeper understanding of humanity through beautiful, redemptive stories that inspire our hearts. If you long to see more love, empathy, and true connection in our world and your own life, you're in the right place. After spending multiple years studying social justice issues, I've realized the power story has in helping us to understand, empathize, and transform our worldviews into something that's just that, views that are truly worldly. Here in this space, we'll embrace our humanity through raw and authentic stories told by real people themselves. We'll amplify their voices and learn to connect in more meaningful ways. Poverty, human trafficking, incarceration, race, immigration, and more. We'll embrace difficult conversations, sometimes controversial topics, and lighthearted stories too. If you wish to uncover the hope, love, empathy, and connection we can find in our fellow humanity, this is a show for you. So, are you ready, lovely? Let's jump in. Well, hello there, lovely. Welcome back to the Love Light Stories podcast, where we create space for real personal stories to be seen, heard, and understood. If you haven't yet, be sure to rate the show, follow, and share it with your family and friends. Today on the podcast, I'm welcoming Kurt Kandler. He is the co-founder and executive director of the 410 Bridge. Founded in 2006 and deriving its name from 1 Peter 4:10, the 410 Bridge is a Christ-centered, community-initiated development organization. From time to time, I like to bring guests on in a thought leader capacity to help us think about issues of humanity in a new way. This is one of those episodes where Kurt helps us understand that if we really want to help the poor, a perspective shift and change is necessary. In this episode, he will challenge your worldview and help you come to understand a new way of looking at poverty and community development. I met Kurt after traveling to Haiti on my first short-term mission trip in 2018. I was so enamored with the unique community development model I witnessed and experienced that week that I fell in love with what they do. I've had the chance to work with Kurt and others at the 410 Bridge as a hyped-up volunteer for 6 years already, leading mission trips back to Haiti and partnering with the community we visited in supporting their self-led development projects. While we no longer are visiting that community, I continue to love and support their work in worldwide communities the 410 Bridge comes alongside. They are one of my favorite organizations, and I'm so excited you get to hear from Kurt today. As you'll see in this episode, the 410 Bridge's unique community development model allows for a shift in worldview, aka how the materially poor see themselves serving as a catalyst for true development and poverty alleviation. Kurt is the mastermind behind it all and is the best at explaining how they're able to help communities lead themselves out of poverty. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Kurt. Kurt, welcome to the Love Light Stories podcast. I am so happy to have you here today.
Oh, I'm the one that's delighted to be here. It's been a long time coming. Thanks for having me.
Yes. You know, we've known each other for quite a few years now, and you have an organization that you started called the 410 Bridge, and I just have absolutely loved your organization because of the way that you go about in helping people who actually really need help, and you do it differently. And before we get into that, I want to say that you have a book called If You Really Want to Help that's outlining all of that. So we're going to be talking about some of the concepts that you talk about here in that book today. But before we get into that, I want to dive into your story, because in the book, you do such a great job outlining how this started and where it's coming from and your experiences in that. So can you help us understand your story a bit?
Sure. So, try to keep that as succinct as possible, because it's, there's stories within stories. But, my history is, I'm a business guy. I'm a marketplace guy. My career has been fairly entrepreneurial, well, really entrepreneurial. And I think that's just a really nice way of saying that I realized early on in my career that I wasn't going to make a very good employee. And so I think I just wanted to do my own thing. And so I love when, presented with an idea, to go and create a business around that idea, if that idea provides value to a potential market. And so I did that throughout my career. And in right after 9/11, the business I had at the time was a direct marketing agency here in Atlanta. We employed about 45 people, and it was a big marketing agency, direct marketing agency. And after 9/11, that business just tanked. It felt like it happened overnight. A lot of our clients went out of business, and I was found in this place without a job and without any income and lots of personally guaranteed debt. And in the book, I refer to that as kind of our family's dark times.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people have a lot darker times than we did for a variety of reasons. But for us, this was a really, really low point. I had 3 kids at the time, all in elementary school. And so long and short of it is that at our kids' school, it was a small little Christian school here in Atlanta that we actually helped start. They were doing a project in Uganda, this little shoebox thing. They would get shoeboxes, and they're supposed to put toys and school supplies and letters or whatever in these boxes. And I wasn't terribly interested in that. I remember hearing about it at the dinner table. Dinner table time was super important in our family when the kids were growing up. But a family from that school went and took these boxes over to Uganda. They went and delivered them. They came back. I found them in my home having dessert and coffee with a bunch of other people, and he was showing pictures of what he did in Uganda. And it was not on my radar. I had much bigger fish to fry. I had lots of problems, lots of issues, a bit panicked. He showed a picture of a school in Uganda, middle of nowhere, Uganda. It was made out of mud and sticks and cow dung and dirt floors, and kids sat on rocks, and there were no teachers, no supplies, no books, rickety desks. And I was like, he said, every time that rains, the walls crumble and the community has to kind of repack the walls. And I'm like, that just seems silly to me. Why don't they just build a brick building? And so the next morning, I was in my quiet time, and I was convicted. Again, lots of story within story here, but I was convicted that I needed to go do something about that. Again, I think the book goes into a lot more detail about that, but I was convicted that I should go build them a brick building. Now, that's a really hard decision to do when you're out of work, making no money, working out of your basement, trying to cobble together a living and have all this debt piling up. But I was committed to go do that. And so we went and did that 18 months later. And when I was there, I just was exposed to extreme poverty for the first time. I am a typical American guy that wants to go help, and I feel like I have the money now and the idea that I'd raised the money, and I have the idea of what these people need. And I went over there to go do that, thinking that I was going to make a difference for a generation or two, and realized after a couple of days that what we were doing was of no moment, that it didn't matter. These problems were massive. And my little school building that I was building, and I was doing a little water project too, was just really not helpful. It was helpful, but it wasn't going to solve any problem that I thought it was solving.
Right.
And so that's kind of the backdrop for coming home. And again, being really convicted, having some defining moments in my life around I needed to go figure out a better way to go engage the poor, or there was a better way. I didn't need to figure out, but there was a better way to engage the poor. And again, convicted to go do that. And that was kind of the genesis of 410 Bridge, realizing that, we have to rethink how we are helping the poor, because more often what I've learned over the 20 years now almost is that we actually do more harm than good.
Yeah.
We're well-intentioned, Our hearts are in the right place, but our tactics are really, really broken for a variety of reasons. And yeah, that's kind of how it started.
Okay, what was it specifically when you were there that helped you realize that what you were doing was not actually going to really help them?
Back then, I was using different language than I use today, but the problem and the identification of the solutions were the same. And that I would say, I was walking around this community and nobody was helping us, right? We had contracted some guys to help us lay bricks for the school building, but nobody was helping us. The community was not engaged in this solution. And I remember saying, thinking to myself, and guys, this can be misinterpreted. So hopefully you hear my heart in this, but why did they think the way they think? Why are the men sitting around doing nothing? When we're building this school building and they're not helping, why are the women in the community doing everything? They're running their households, they're running the business, they're watching the livestock, they're working in the farms, and the men are kind of sitting around like, what? Why do people think the way they think? That was the biggest surprise to me of what I was thinking when I was over there is that people's perspectives were broken. Why do they have the perspective that they have? And I say it very differently today, and I have come to learn to understand that in a better way today. But that was the thing that captured me. Our school building, while a physical thing, was going to be helpful to the kids, and the water project was going to be okay. That wasn't going to solve a poverty problem.
Right.
I was going to solve a water problem or an education problem, school building problem, but not a poverty problem. And I thought I was helping solve a poverty problem.
Got it. So that was kind of the turning point at which you came back home and you were like, okay, what I was thinking I was going to do to help actually isn't really going to help solve the poverty problem. What can we do to think differently to actually solve the real underlying issue? And that led to, like you said, the genesis of the 410 Bridge.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, let's dive into that a little bit and your model and how you begin working with communities, because I know that you go in and work really closely with communities, establish a leadership council, all of that. So can you give us an overview of the process and help us kind of understand how you truly empower these communities to lead themselves? And I'm talking about an overview, but also some of the specific things to help us really understand what it is you do.
Okay. Again, that's 45 minutes in and of itself, but let me encapsulate it. So there's a couple key principles that we're an organization that's very disciplined on key fundamental principles. We call them our guiding principles. And those guiding principles are important because we're in a very emotional space. People are suffering in a lot of different ways, and emotion can take over. And so we need to have these guardrails in place that keep us focused on what we've been called to go do. And so one of the principles is, first, that we are invited into a community. We don't just show up because there are needs and we think we can help with those needs. I just showed up in Budalali because some organization out of Kampala thought that they needed a school building, or I saw a school building and I wanted to solve that problem. So our 410 Bridge is invited first. Once we're invited, we're very clear that we're really not here to do anything for you, which sounds a little heartless, but that's a comma. We're not here to really do anything for you, but we are here to do with you. And we found that we can go a long way together if you establish leaders of your community. So we create a leadership council after we're invited. We create a leadership council that can be elected, it can be appointed, however it is, but there's a group of leaders that we want that represent all of the constituents within their community. Women, not just men, but women, the youth, the elderly. And that is the group of people that are going to work with us closely to move toward outcomes that they desire, not outcomes that we see. So far, we haven't talked anything about needs. We've just been invited in to help, which changes the conversation from an outsider coming in to an insider because we've been invited. We establish leaders, and then we go through an assessment process that's pretty cool around just trying to understand the community, what's going on in the community, what are their strengths, what are their gifts, what are their assets, what do they do so well they could teach others, what do they love about their community, what do they love about living here. I always say to them, look, if I were going to move here to your community, tell me why I should want to live here. And it just, again, changes the conversation from needs and deficits to strengths. We
Yes.
start there. And then we ultimately move to, if you could change one thing in your community, what's the one thing that you would want to change? What would you not want your children or grandchildren to deal with that you're currently dealing with today? And you only can have one thing to start. It's just, what's your top priority? And they work together as a group of leaders over an extended period of time to figure out, well, what is that one thing? And let's say that it's water, because they don't have clean, safe water. Let's just hypothetically say that's the case. Well, then we move into what we call an empowerment analysis, which basically says, hey, look, if you have a water problem and that's your number one problem and you want to solve that, what is the solution that you think needs to be put in place to solve that problem? How much of that solution can you do on your own? How much of that solution do you need help from outsiders? And how much of that solution is outside of anyone's control? And that starts getting them to think about what their responsibility is to solve their problem. And what we say is things like, look, the water problem that exists in your community doesn't exist in my community. And the solution to your water problem doesn't exist in my community either. It exists right here in your community. And we're helping you to pull us into that solution. So I'll just finish with this idea of the rope. I talk about the rope in the book, and it's a great kind of object lesson. And if we're our staff, me, whatever, are in a group, in a community with a group of leaders, and I say, look, if you have a need and I throw you a rope and you're hanging onto one end of the rope and I have the hanging on the other end of the rope and we pull that rope tight, if we try to push you, we're not going to go very far. But if you pull us, meaning you want to lead, and you're a good leader, we want to follow you, we can go a long way together, but you have to pull, which means we're not coming in to tell you what we're going to do for you. You need to tell us, where do you want to go 5, 10 years from today? And let's help you get to that place. And that is a paradigm shift of how we engage the poor. So what we learned early on is that we can't be successful over there without assistance from the West, but we also can't be successful over there unless we change this paradigm of how the West engages the poor. And so there's two sides to the bridge, and that's what we do. But in the community, they have to pull, they have to lead. We have to humble ourselves to let them lead, let them make mistakes. And when we do that, we can go a long way together.
Yes, I love what you said, is that they can't do all of it without support from the West, but the West can't really help them without them leading themselves. And help us understand why that is a little bit more. Like, why is it that we can't just go in with these solutions and just solve it for them?
Because we rise and fall in our definitions. That's a fundamental principle for us. If we're going to have if there's a problem that we've identified, we better define it well. Or that's just a classic kind of business approach, is like, if you're going to solve a problem, how do you define that problem? Because you could put a solution in place that defines a different problem. Mm-hmm. So it starts with, and again, we rise and fall in our definitions. So it starts with our definition of poverty. And 410 Bridge doesn't define poverty as a material problem. It's a issue of worldview. What I would say back in Uganda was people's perspectives. Today I talk about it and using the term worldview. It's an issue of how people think. And what we've learned is that people's worldview, the story they're telling themselves to be true, the conversation they're having in their head, their perspective, drive the choices they make. And those choices drive the actions people take all over the world. You have a worldview, I have a worldview, and we have choices based on that story we're telling ourselves to be true. And that has more to do with whether or not a group of people will live in deprivation or thrive, more than anything else, in my experience. Wow. And so, yes, do they need resources? Yes, do they need infrastructure? Yes, do we help them build capacity? Of course we do. But just coming in and identifying a need and solving a problem, see a problem, solve a problem, is not going to solve the poverty problem. Again, I ask organizations all the time when they come to me and say, hey, how can you help us move toward a 410 Bridge methodology? And I'm saying, well, first, what problem are you looking to solve? And they say, we're trying to solve a poverty problem. I'm like, yeah, not really. You may be trying to solve an education problem, maybe trying to solve a water problem, but not a poverty problem. And how do you define poverty? And most Americans, most Westerners define poverty as a financial, material problem. And it is not, in my view. The other definition that's super important is how you define development. And in our world, how we define development is that which people do for themselves. It's not what outsiders come in and do for people. It's what people do on their own. So we don't measure our success by what we do. We measure our success by what the community does on its own. That's true development. That's what's going to make their poverty solutions sustainable for them long after we leave. And
Yes.
so that's why a Western organization can't come in, see a problem, solve a problem, because then it's an outsider's solution. It's not their own. They don't own it. They don't see it as their own. If it breaks, or if it just falls apart, or if it just doesn't continue, they don't see it as their problem. They see it, or their solution. They see it as somebody outside their community came in and did this to help us, but it's not our solution. And so that's why that doesn't work.
Right. And sometimes because those solutions aren't working, they're just abandoned, like you've kind
Right.
of mentioned. Okay, so now how does the community actually lead and participate? Can you give us some examples of what they do? You're coming alongside of that, but they're leading.
Yeah, it all comes back to two, again, fundamental principles. One is a leadership council. You have to have indigenous volunteer, not paid, but volunteer leaders who have a vision for their community and are prepared to go mobilize and unify their community toward their development goals. That's super important. Well, when they mobilize and unify their community around the development goals that they have, that just inherently gets the community involved in the solutions, starts solving their own problem. And so community participation in every program is super important. Whether it's an infrastructure thing like a school building or a water project or something that needs to be built, they need to participate in the building of that so that they see that as their own. It's not ours, it's theirs. Their community, their problem, their solution. Now, if it's a capacity building program like business training or farming training or schooling or whatever it might be, they're participating because they're being trained. But just because you're trained, this is another flaw, I think, by a lot of Western solutions, is they'll do training, but there's really no fruit from that training. So we want people in our community to come to our entrepreneurship training, business training, or how to start a small business, but then be in business. And so one of the other fundamental principles that we have that speaks to this is that we are, I believe that organizations need to be outcome-based, not process-based. By that I mean is, I don't care how many trainings we run in a community. Are those trainings achieving the outcomes that the community wants? For
Right.
example, average household income in one of our communities is under $2 a day when we start. Well, at what level provides them the capacity to go solve their own problems, put their kids in school and pay school fees, have a water tap in their home, move from firewood to propane, whatever it might be? They need a certain amount of income to do that. And they also need to think differently about that income. What does God say about money? What does it say? We talk about savings. We talk about generosity. We talk about things like that as it relates to business. But I don't care if we want to run one training or 100 trainings. The trainings isn't what we're going to measure. It's going to be the outcome that we're achieving. And so many organizations begin to measure or continue to measure what they've always done without really looking at, are they achieving the outcomes that they've been called to go achieve? And when we're set out to solve a poverty problem, the only way to solve a poverty problem, in my opinion, is holistically, all areas, physically, spiritually, socially, relationally, all of those things have to be done holistically. And how do you know if you've gotten to a place where they are no longer living in extreme poverty? That's the question. And
Right.
and then any programs that you run need to go drive toward those outcomes. It's complicated, but it's really cool when it happens.
Yes. Okay. Let's dive into that a little bit. This holistic development, because you've mentioned a couple examples where you're like, we're not just going to do a well project or build a school that's not solving poverty. And so, what you're saying is that in order to really allow community development to happen, you have to do it from a holistic standpoint. And they are interdependent amongst themselves, the different projects that you do. So, can you explain this infrastructure capacity that you have and then the people capacity and how those different programs are interdependent to create this holistic development model?
Yeah, great question. So there is this, again, interdependency, as you talked about it, between all of these areas of need and solutions to solve those problems. They're interdependent. And so there is a sequential look at this. And it starts with, it's really, we are capacity builders, right? We're trying to help people build capacity. Well, if women and children are walking 5 hours every day to go access their daily water that is unsafe, unsafe meaning it makes them sick, not only are they taking all that time to go get the water, but then they're coming back and they're ill. They're not going to school. They're not running small businesses. They don't have the capacity to go do these things to self-develop because they're spending all their time on water. So that
Right.
is typically what we call kind of infrastructure capacity. What are infrastructural things in a community that people need that would lift their capacity to go do the other things that they need to do to move and to continue to develop? And so it's typically I'm thinking about it in an East African context. Water is a big deal. People are walking long distances for water every day, taking them hours before they can go to school, before they can go run a business or take care of their household or tend to their farms. And so when we solve a water problem by bringing water closer and distributing it amongst the community, the outcome that leaders will typically say as an example would be something like, we ask the question, when are we finished? When are you finished with water? Well, if we could get 80% of our households, they'd say, to have access to clean, safe water within a 10-minute walk of their homes, that would be awesome. Because right now they're walking 3 and 4 hours. Well, that's the outcome. So what is the solution to drive to that outcome? As opposed to seeing a water problem and going and putting in a prefabbed water solution, a shallow well or something, we think we're solving the problem, but we're really not solving the problem that they need. So once we build their capacity physically, well, then we move to, and that could be also, they don't have a school, they don't have school buildings, they don't have clinic, they don't have some infrastructure that occupies or limits their capacity to develop. Once we do those things, and kind of simultaneous to doing those things, we can go start doing human capacity things like training. How do you run a small business? How do you farm more effectively? How do you improve the quality of education in the school? How do you create trainings and learnings to make a healthier community? Well, if you have clean, safe water, that solves a lot of the health problems. If you solve an education problem, that solves some health problems. If you're solving an income problem, wealthier people are typically healthier people. And so there's just this integration between these solutions that you get a multiplicative impact inside a community when you go holistically. If we were a water organization and wanted to do water solutions, we could do that anywhere in the world. But what problem are we solving? We're not solving a poverty problem. We're solving a water problem.
Right.
So that's how we see it. And again, in everything that we do, and I think I've not made a big enough point of this, but in everything that we are doing in that I've just outlined, there is a worldview training, a worldview shift, a teaching that helps people think differently about themselves, their relationship with God, their relationship with each other, their relationship with their environment, with their neighbors, that help them think differently so that they can sustain their development long after we leave. That's the secret sauce to solving the poverty problem.
Yes. And so it's the worldview perspective. And also, you mentioned their relationship with God. I know that their faith and biblical training is a key aspect by which you introduce these concepts as well of the self-actualization and human dignity and things like that. Can you just explain a little bit of how you use faith to come alongside these programs and partner with the churches?
Well, it's the foundation. I mean, so I'm a follower of Jesus, and pastor of my church says, Jesus makes life better and makes me better at life. And I believe that to be true. I've seen that to be true. I've seen too much in my life, I've seen evidence of that. And so it's the foundation of everything we do. Yet the challenge is in these communities is that there are churches in these communities. And we want the local church to be the hero of this development effort. But most people don't go to church in these communities. So how do we bring a biblical worldview, a Christian biblical worldview that says God loves me, He's created me for a purpose, I'm forgiven, and therefore I should be a forgiver, and I have responsibilities. I have responsibilities to be a godly father, godly mother, godly spouse, godly parent, godly school teacher, godly leader, godly doctor, godly business owner. How do you do that when most people only get that from their local church, but 70-ish% of the people in our communities in Kenya don't really attend church, especially the men? Well, that means that in every program that we run, we want to bring God's truth to people that's relevant to the program that they're being trained on. And let me give you some examples I always give, and that is one in our business startup training. This is training of 25 to 50 people who are learning how to run a profitable small business. And there's basic business skills that they're taught, but as good as those are, if we just created businesses that were run in a secular way, we will not have been successful. And so we're teaching them about what God says about money. What does he say about generosity? What does he say about resources that he's given you, that he wants you to start with what you have? You have everything that you need in front of you to change the quality of your life. But it's because you think the way you think that you don't see that. What does God say about your relationships with your neighbors? Your neighbors are your customers. You can't have a successful business without customers. And if everybody in your community hates you because you are a cheat, you're not honest, and you're just trying to take advantage of people, you're not going to have a successful business. So you have to repair those relationships. What does God say about wealth? A classic worldview on wealth is that it's a zero-sum game. Stephanie, if you're rich, my worldview is that you got that from somebody else, and because you're wealthy, someone else is poor. We have to shift that worldview. That's not true. God wants us to live an abundant life. We have abundance, and it can grow. It's not zero-sum. How do we change all that in the context of business, so that the local churches no longer are this house of no, where they go to hear all the things they can't do. And the churches actually become attractive to people. We do it in farming. We do it in our education programs, in our business programs, in some health programs. Everything that we do has that biblical worldview component to it. And again, I can't say it enough. That's the secret sauce, in my experience, to sustaining the solutions to move people out of extreme poverty to a place where they can self-develop. They have to think differently. And we want them, and I think, that God created things with order. He created things with a purpose. And if we can get people to see that and to follow Jesus, he will make life better and make them better at life. And they'll do more to solve their poverty problem without us than they will with us. I'll go to
Yes.
my deathbed on that one.
Yes. And ultimately, God is the creator of everything, and he's the one we can lean on. And again, it's not leaning on an organization from the West like the 410 Bridge. It's realizing I have everything I need within myself, community, and with God supporting us. And I know you talk about that even in more depth in your book here. So I think that I'm so glad you really went in depth on that concept, because it is, like you said, the secret sauce of what creates that change in worldview. And so you have the faith as the foundation, you're changing worldviews, you're diving deep in communities through a holistic model. You do different projects and programs across water and health and education, economic development, foundations for farming, business training, all of these areas that then create this picture of a community that's leading themselves in their own development.
Yep.
And I mean, it's just such a beautiful depiction of honoring human dignity and allowing them to flourish, like helping them realize they have what they need to flourish and that they don't need you. And so anyway, I want to go into a couple of stories, because you actually highlight a lot of stories in this book, but there's a couple just diving into these different programs that you have that I think really help depict what it is, the success of what's happening here. So one of them is Lucy's story. She's the one where you mentioned that people have to walk for miles. And not only was she walking for miles, but she was not getting very much sleep. She was getting up super early in the morning and going on this dangerous water journey. Can you just explain that a little bit and help us understand that?
Lucy is our longest tenured staff member over there. Been with us for 2008. She grew up in this community called Gamba that 410 Bridge works in. That's how we met Lucy. And she worked her way through school and ultimately wanted to go help other communities. And so she's been on staff with 410 over there for a while. But she would tell the story of her mother would wake her up very early in the morning. There was no water in Gamba. And there was a private well on a ranch, private ranch that raised livestock. Don't think of a ranch as in a Yellowstone ranch. It's just a livestock. But they had water, and but it was the community was not. It was against the law to access that water, and the owner of that closed that water source off to the community, and so they would have to go steal that water, sneak and get that water. So she'd get up at 3:00, 3:30 every morning, and her mother would walk to, with jerry cans on their head and on these straps, and they would walk to go get this water. And The reason it was dangerous is, back in that day, there were buffalo, Cape buffalo, that are very dangerous, especially when they're alone. And they'd be, it's pitch dark. There's no electricity, there's no lights, there's no nothing. It's just pitch black. And she would walk every morning or every other day to get this water source. And her mother would put her kind of off to the side while she ran into the ranch, filled up her water container, and then come back and get Lucy's. And, she would tell her times she'd come face to face with a water buffalo or a Cape buffalo or some other animal that was super dangerous. And so for Lucy, that is a very real memory for her. That is the way life was. Now, did she know any different at the time? She knew no different. She never dreamed that her community would have to not do that. Now, she's a mother of multiple children today, and she's married, and she's amazing. But today she looks at Gamba. Gamba has been graduated from the 410 Bridge Relationship, and they have sustainable, clean, safe water projects around their community that are distributed around the community, that pay for themselves, that they sustain them, and and young children are no longer making that walk. Now, that may seem like just a project and just solving the water problem. Well, that's true. Until you solve that problem, the children, gathering water is typically relegated to the children and the women in the community. They don't have the capacity to get and go do anything else, schooling, running a business, anything else. So you can't just stop there. And that's what Lucy sees. She saw the cumulative effect of doing all of these solutions that are interdependent. And again, you get a multiplicative impact from it. And she saw that firsthand in her community. And she shares that story. She shared that story with us. I tried to share it as much as I could in the book. And she's super grateful, but she also understands this is how my neighbors, my community will never go back to being in extreme poverty ever again. Because it not only was the physical things that were done, but it was also their ownership of those solutions, their sustainability, indigenous sustainability of those solutions, and then also that they think differently about where they're headed and where they're going and how to get there. They're doing that on their own.
Yes. And that's exactly what you hope for and what you're doing. It's just incredible that the model is actually working. Okay, so here's another story. I mean, there's so many stories. All of them in the book are so incredibly good, and we're not going to be able to cover all of them. So for those listening, I really do encourage you to go get this book and read it, because you're going to be so energized and excited to hear and read these stories of this model working. But another story that I want to highlight is Stephen and Sabina. They're a husband and wife. Yes,
really
yes. And Foundations for Farming is really the program that Stephen got involved with. But what it did mostly was change his life and how he showed up in his marriage and with his family. So dig into that a little bit.
So it's my favorite. I love marriage. I love family. I love that. I just love it. And so we met Stephen. He also was in Gamba, by the way, the same community that Lucy grew up in. And Stephen would tell you that he was a drunkard. He was worthless. These are his words, not mine. I was worthless. I was a drunkard. I did not work. I hung out with the other men in the community, and whatever money my wife, Sabina, made, I would steal it from her and go and buy a local brew, and I would be drunk all day. That was who Stephen was. And Sabina, his wife, she doesn't even like to talk about those years because they were so difficult, where she could never get ahead. Her kids were suffering because they couldn't pay school fees. Any little bit of money that she would make through day labor in some way, he would spend. And we were presented with an opportunity to take 30 farmers from Gamba and send them to Zimbabwe to learn Foundations for Farming. And basically, Foundations for Farming is a spinoff of Farming God's Way, but that pretty much says what it is. It's farming God's way. God made the soil to work in a certain way. These are the techniques that you can do to maximize your yields from your farm. And it's a really powerful technical training for small scale farmers. But that in and of itself isn't the solution. The solution is that God made things to work a certain way. He made them in order, and created them with order. And you got to do things on time, at a standard, without waste, with joy. He's the creator of all things, and he wants to have a relationship with you. And this changed Stephen's life incredibly, where he came back And he made amends with his wife. He went to work. He deployed the training that he learned for Foundations for Farming. She went and did our business startup training. And when I did the book, I went back and I wanted to interview them because I just love them. And I asked them, hey, how did you think before 410 Bridge arrived? And how do you think today? And they would say things like, this is what they told me. He said, Kurt, we will never go back to being poor again. We are not going to be a burden to our children, because in our society, once the parents reach a certain age, the children are called to care for them. We're not going to be a burden to our children. Look at my farm. He's got a massive farm now, growing all sorts of things. She's a successful business person. They're training and leading other people in our community, not because they necessarily just learned the skills, but because they think differently about their relationship with God, their relationship with each other, their relationship with their environment and their community. And it is an amazing story, which I did not do justice with here, but it's in the book, and hopefully that the story in the book does a better job.
Yes, exactly. It is just an absolutely incredible story. And you mentioned how they're now training and mentoring others in the community. And we don't need to get into the stories here, but there are multiple stories where that is actually happening, where people have realized that they have this success inside of them, and they learn how to do these different programs. They then are mentoring others in their community to do the same, which is that ripple effect of generosity that's stemming from these programs rooted in human dignity and the principles of God. And that's why I think what you're doing is, like we've talked about, so much more than just poverty alleviation and community development. I mean, people's lives are changing through these biblical principles, and it's just really, really incredible. Another story that I want to mention is the story of Honduras. This community in Honduras, they went through the asset mapping at the very beginning of your program and realized they could solve their own problem, and
Right.
you never even had to help them do it.
Exactly. It was a complete shift in their thinking, and just very quickly, they identified. And I said earlier, what's the one thing that you want to change if you could change something? They identified roads. They were living on the top of a mountain, and they had dairy and a lot of product, coffee and things, but they could never get any of that stuff down to market because the roads up this mountain took almost an hour to get up, and they were just awful. And so we went through this empowerment analysis of how much of the road solution can you do on your own? How much of the road solution do you need help from outsiders? And how much of the road solution is beyond anyone's control? It was that simple kind of an exercise. But ultimately, the question becomes, well, who are these outsiders? And they identified that they thought they could do 40% of the road solution on their own, but they needed 60% of the solution from outsiders. And the question is, well, who are the outsiders? Is it 410 Bridge? Are you looking for us to come in and help you with the roads? Are you not going to do your 40% before you look for somebody to come in and do their 60? And who are these outsiders? Well, government could help us. There's other organizations. Well, okay, whose responsibility is it to go find, the government official to go help you, or this other organization to help you? And they realize that it's their responsibility as leaders to be advocates for their community, to go solve their problems on their own. And so they're really 100% responsible for their solutions. And that's what they did. Literally 2 months later, I came back to that community and the road was fixed. And they said to us, look, we just never thought that way before. We were always thinking it was the government's responsibility to solve this for us, and we would just complain that they weren't doing it. When you showed us that it's our responsibility and that we're empowered to go solve these solutions on our own, we went to the government and said, look, we'll do 40% if you do 60%. And the mayor said, great, I'll do that. And they fixed the road. Now, it's a very quick, simple approach to, explanation of it, but that really is fundamentally it. We have to get people's worldview to shift to a place where it's a Christian biblical worldview that says they can, they should, and whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right. That type of thing, they can, they should, and when they get that, they'll do more without us than they will with us. And that's the beautiful part of our model, I think.
Yes, I love it so much. And I've heard you say many times, too, that it's not just their worldview that needs to change, but it's also the worldview in the West. Let's dig into that quickly.
A big learning when I wrote this book was, a lot of empowerment. A couple of principles is that you can't empower people against their will. you can put them in an environment that's empowering, but unless they claim their empowerment, unless they own it, nothing you're going to do is going to get them to be empowered. That's true for any human being, right?
Yep.
Why aren't they claiming their empowerment? Well, one of the worldviews is a victim mentality. Look at all the things that happen to me. You should have some empathy and sympathy for me because of all these things that are happening to me. It's outside of my control that all these things are happening to me. And that's got to shift. And I think the learning has been that, one, you can't empower people against their will. But if the poor, broadly speaking, is a label, if the poor see themselves as victims, they're going to always be looking to outsiders to solve their problem for them. But in the West, if we see them as victims, they don't have the capability of solving their problem on their own. We're never going to be able to empower them against their will. What we have to change on our side of the bridge is that these are capable, industrious, wonderful, joyful people that can teach us more about what it means to have joy in the midst of having nothing than anything we could teach them. And we have to change how we see them, not as a set of problems to be solved, but seeing them as the solution to their poverty problem. And when you no longer see the poor as a set of problems to be solved, water problem, education problem, health problem, when you don't see them as a set of problems to be solved anymore and see them as a solution, your paradigm shifts. You want them to lead, you're going to follow. You're going to let them make mistakes. You're not going to go do for them, you're going to do with them. But that starts over here. And so many times I've seen way too many organizations, most of them, see them as the savior for the poor, and therefore that means we got to come in and save the day for them. And I think Bob Lupton, in his book Toxic Charity, he says, when you do something for someone that has the capacity to do it for themselves, you disempower them. Yes. That is the polar opposite of what we want to go do. But that starts over here. That means we have to change how we think over here if we really want to engage the poor in a healthy way.
That is a really powerful conviction and a realization and perspective that I think is hard to notice until it's explained to you in that way. I think we're all in the West kind of just indoctrinated into this thinking because that's how it's been done by so many organizations for so long. And that's what I love about what you're doing and others like Bob Lupton. And the Chalmers Center is another one that really ascribes to this type of model in that helping us understand that the worldview does begin with us and it's all about our perspective.
And you wonder why. The question is kind of like, well, why do we think like we do? Why do we think that a savior mentality is appropriate? Well, a variety of reasons, but one of the other things that we've come to learn is that, and it's a principle again, is that, we have to separate on our side of the bridge, we have to separate what we give and how we give it from our need to feel good about ourselves. So at the end of the day, and people get really rubbed the wrong way when I say that, but at the end of the day, it's a lack of humility that could we possibly think that, well, it's our idea and our money, and therefore it should be our way. Could we possibly believe that they actually might have a better solution to their problems than we do? And if we don't believe that, that's a lack of humility.
Yes.
And so it feels pretty good to go over and build a school building in Uganda and do a little water project. I could have left there, dusted off my hands and thought, wow, I helped. But right. I was convicted pretty clearly that I was not helping. I made every mistake, I think, in the book. Oh my gosh, I'm mortified by some of the things we did, but God redeems it, and we have to rethink how to engage the poor if we're actually going to go help them, and hopefully that's what this book does.
Right, and I think another thing too is that we don't understand the poor because we're not in proximity to the poor, or I'm saying the poor, but people living in poverty, right? Material poverty, and I think that's part of it. And so again, what your model is doing is you're coming to understand them and their needs, listening to them rather than ascribing and being in proximity. And I think that's a huge distinction here too, because we can't possibly create solutions for things that we don't fully understand. And they understand it best themselves.
And we want to help the poor without really knowing the poor.
Yes.
Shame on us.
Yes.
Because they're amazing.
Yes.
I mean, I label them the poor, but I mean, people struggling with extreme poverty have so much to teach us.
That's so true.
And if we do that through relationship and earning the right to be heard and getting to know them and getting to understand their perspective and their solutions, as opposed to thinking that we have the answers to everything. I end this book with asking our staff in all the countries where we work, if you were sitting in a room full of well-intentioned, capable, resourced donors in the West, and you could say anything to them, how would you finish these two sentences? If you really want to help, which of course is the title of the book, if you really want to help, start doing these things. And if you really want to help, stop doing these things. And I just sent them those questions and said, tell me what you think. How would you answer that? And man, their answers came back. And I thought, this is a great way to end this book because it's really convicting. If you really want to help, leave. When the project is done, when you're finished, leave. Don't overstay your welcome. If you really want to help, stop coming here with thinking that you have the solutions to our problems. If you really want to help, start pouring into leaders. I mean, they lay it out all out. And it's like, wow, these are the people on the ground, on the front lines. They understand the problems, they understand the solutions, and this would be their answer to us.
Yes.
Now, we are very generous people, and we are very helpful people, and we are well-intentioned, but good intentions are not good enough, in my view. We've got to come up with a new paradigm of how to engage the poor to effectively help them, and that's what we try to do around here.
Yeah, I want to highlight one last example of that, actually, like good intentions are not good enough. It's a really funny story. I was laughing out loud when I read it. It was the story of the cows and the latrines.
So we would go over there, and you can imagine, you go over there, and people are living in small little huts with thatched roofs and cow dung walls, mud and sticks, and every time it rains, the walls crumble like that school building did in Uganda. And people come over and they say, well, these people need houses. We need to build them houses. So they would go and build them houses without asking if they want houses. They would just build them, and I'm feeling pretty good about ourselves because we went and just built all these houses. And they come back a couple years later, and people were not living in the houses. They didn't want the houses, but it seemed like a pretty safe place to keep their cows, which was their wealth, which was everything to them. And so to protect their livestock, they would go put these cows in these homes. And of course, the people, the Americans or the Westerners, whoever it was, come back and are aghast by that. They're appalled by that. How could we come over here and build you houses and you put your animals in these houses? Well, you never asked them. You never listened to them. You had the answer to their problem. And I mean, it's kind of funny. I mean, it's not really funny because it's an enormous waste of resources.
Yeah.
But we don't ask, we tell. And
right.
we should do more asking.
Exactly. And I think the latrines, they just weren't using the latrines because they had a different solution, and so they didn't need them. So in both instances, they just created something that they didn't really.
I get frustrated with that. I go over there and I know there's technology, there's solutions, there's compost latrines, there's whatever thing would make the community healthier. But culture matters, Stephanie. Culture matters. And you're not going to go over there with a Western culture and change their hundreds-year-old culture of how they do their business, how they live, you just can't come in and swoop in and put a Western solution in place and expect them to adopt it.
Right.
You have to walk with them and again, earn the right to be heard and listen to them and let them lead and let them fail and get some things right and get some things wrong. And you do that through relationship. That's why our relationships with our communities are multi-year relationships, a decade long.
Yes.
We're graduating a community this year. We've been walking with this community for 13 years. It's a long time.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that a community is graduating, because that's ultimately where I wanted to end, because this model is working. And it's like you said, you go an inch deep and a mile deep and an inch wide, right?
Right, exactly. Mile deep, inch wide.
Yes. But over these time periods, like you're trying to work yourself out of this job. You don't want to have to continue walking with the community. The goal is to create that capacity where they are then sustainable on their own. And that is actually happening.
Yep. It sure is. It's amazing.
Yes.
It doesn't happen everywhere. It doesn't happen every time. I don't want to make it sound like it does, but we'll graduate our 13th community this year. Graduation is basically, again, it goes back to when I talked about outcomes, establishing the outcomes before you even really get started. Where are we trying to, what's your vision for your community? Where do you want to go? How do you know that you're going to get there? If you don't know where you're going, how do you know you're ever get there, right? So we have those outcomes. And as we start accomplishing 80%-ish of those outcomes, we can start thinking about graduating a community. And graduation simply is, it's reached a place, a community has gotten to a place that it has defined as the outcomes that it hoped for 10, 12, 8, however many years prior. And there's a big celebration. All the partners come in, the community comes out, lots of speeches, lots of celebration. And what are they celebrating? They don't want us to leave. We have a relationship for a number of years. We're friends, we're family. But, it's like your kids at home. Sooner or later, they got to leave the nest, right?
Yeah.
And so what we are celebrating is how much the community has done on its own. We're celebrating what God has done in their community and what they've done on their own. Look how far you've come. We don't ever talk about all the things we did. Again, we don't measure our success by what we do. We measure our success by what they do on their own. And it's a huge celebration. It's really cool. It's what we strive for. We are trying to work ourselves out of a job as quickly as we can so we can go help another community somewhere else. But once we work ourselves out of a job, they'll continue that journey of development long after we leave. And that's the key to solving that poverty problem.
Wonderful. It's absolutely beautiful. Just an incredible picture. Okay, so before we wrap up, Kurt, I want to ask where we can find your book, how we can follow 410, support 410, anything that you want to say there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the time here and to help me work through all the things that are in the book. I think there's a lot in there that we didn't talk about, but you can get the book on Amazon. It's called If You Really Want to Help, Redefining the War on Poverty. You can search on my name, Kurt Kandler, K-U-R-T. You can go to 410bridge.org to learn more about what 410 Bridge is doing. One of the best ways to get engaged in what we do is to walk alongside the life of a child in one of our communities. So if you want to sponsor a child and walk with that child as they go through their journey of development, that's a really cool thing to engage with and correspond with that child as they work their way through school. We'd appreciate that help. And yeah, so that's how you can. There's a small group study that's going to be coming out in the coming months on extreme poverty and how to engage and how to really help. I think it'll be a challenging study. It's going to be different. So look for that. But more on that later. Maybe I'll get back on your podcast
when that's exciting. I didn't know that. I am going to be all into that. That is so exciting.
I probably shouldn't have mentioned it because I'm at the end of stages of writing it, and it's like, oof, it's a lot.
Yeah. So
months yet, but
it'll still be coming. It'll be coming in the future.
Right.
Awesome. Wonderful. Well, Kurt, this has just been so fun to reconnect and be able to discuss this and share it with everybody. I think it's just a gift that you've given us this opportunity to start thinking about our own worldview and our shift in how we view people living in material poverty. So thank you so much.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Stephanie.
Lots to think about, right? One of my favorite parts about the 410 Bridge is the story of their inception. The idea for this organization began with Kurt's personal experience of trying to help the poor and realizing he wasn't helping them at all. Thankfully, his well-meaning intentions became a catalyst to finding a better way that actually does help. Their model is truly unique and requires that we do with, rather than for, those living in material poverty. Did you find yourself deep in thought with lots of intriguing thoughts or questions as Kurt explained how and why they operate? I love what Kurt said about our worldview too. He said, just like someone struggling with poverty will never become empowered if they embrace a victim mentality, the West will never succeed in empowering people if we see them as victims, mirroring the way they often see themselves. It's a powerful statement and one that many of us probably haven't thought of before. I certainly didn't understand the power of our own worldview to affect the materially poor before I became so involved with the 410 Bridge. They offer such a unique and life-giving perspective that translates into real outcomes and communities around the world. There's so much I've learned from the 410 Bridge over the last several years, and so much more I'd love to say about this amazing organization and how they engage with the materially poor, but I think Kurt did such a great job illustrating the power of their empowerment model that I'll just stop right there. To dig deeper in understanding their work or to even get involved, there's a few ways you can do so right now. First, grab Kurt's book titled, If You Really Want to Help, Redefining the War on Poverty, to dig deeper into today's topic. Second, go to the410bridge.org to see the initiatives they currently have happening in communities. And third, consider sponsoring a child. When you sponsor a child, not only are you supporting that child, but supporting programs that lift the entire community in which they live. Are you loving this episode? Come join us in the Love Light Stories Facebook community, where we make this show come to life. My goal is to make this more than a podcast and truly create a space where we can learn and grow alongside one another in community. Here, we can learn alongside each other with curiosity and humility, and ultimately emulate more love and light to all we meet. You'll be the first to know about upcoming coffee chats, in-person events, book studies, and more. It's here where we'll go deeper in discussion around the topics we explore on the show. You'll even have the chance to meet guests from time to time. Go to stephaniemjacobs.com/manifesto to join. You'll receive an instant download of our manifesto with access to the community. Oh, and did I mention it's all free? So what are you waiting for? Come join us. I just can't wait to meet you, lovely. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast and leaning into today's story. And don't forget, you can subscribe to the show wherever you listen to your podcasts so you don't ever miss an episode. And a great way you can support these conversations is to rate the show and leave a review. And if you have a friend who would like these stories, share it with them too. All of these things are the best way you can support this podcast. So thank you. And until next time, lovelies, keep radiating that love and light to everyone you meet.